Okay, let's begin with radiometric dating. I'm going to do a little bit of review with this. Okay, radiometric dating often is referred to as radio clocks and touted as a method of calculating how long certain rocks have been in existence. In particular, with radiometric dating, we are attempting to date igneous rocks. We're attempting to figure out when those rocks cooled initially. Okay, remember that there are three types of rocks. You have igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. When we're dealing with our radiometric dating, the first thing you need to know is that we're dealing with igneous rocks that have formed from molten magma or lava. Okay, and so it's an attempt, radiometric dating is an attempt to calculate when a particular rock sample cooled. So basically then it would be telling you how old the rock is. So it's an attempt to be a radio clock. We can apparently, as soon as that rock is formed and starts cooling, the radio clock is set, and then billions of years later or millions of years later, we can go back and calculate when that clock was set. So radiometric dating. All right, let's review. What is the evolutionary age of the Earth? Basically around 4.5 billion years. We talked in the last section, and here we are, especially in this section on geology, we are dealing with old Earth versus young Earth, because evolutionary geology is the basis of geology, secular geology in the day that we live in. So why do we date the Earth at about 4.6 billion years? There they are again. The evolutionary paradigm, number one. Number two, uniformitarianism. And now number three, radiometric dating. Have they established 4.6 or 4.5, whatever? Have they established that with radiometric dating? The answer is yes. How did they do it? Who remembers? What did they use to initially get that? Yes? Meteorites. Several different meteorites have been dated at 4.5, 4.6. The oldest Earth rocks have not been dated quite that old because theoretically they've been subjected to weathering and other Earth processes. So they have dated things this old using radiometric dating. So we need to discuss what is radiometric dating, how does it work, and in our case, what's wrong with radiometric dating? Can we trust the dates of those meteorites at 4.6 billion years? Can we trust that date? Why or why not? Okay, so geologic time. Remember, geologic time has been established using relative time and absolute time. You must know the difference between relative time and absolute time. In secular geology, these are the two kinds or two types of time. Relative time, remember what is relative? It's placing events in order of oldest to youngest. It's relative. It doesn't give a number. It just establishes, okay, this is older than this, or this is younger than this. That's a comparative type of dating. So it's called relative dating. Places events or formations, rock formations, in order, oldest to youngest. Absolute time is called absolute time because it uses numbers. It assigns a specific age to an event or a specific age to a rock formation. Okay, and of course relative time is based on their positions. What is the main principle used for relative time dating? The law of superposition, right? The law of superposition states that the older rocks are going to be on the bottom. That's one of the major principles. one of the major principles of relative dating that are going to be used. And then absolute time is based on two techniques, correlation or radiometric dating. Okay, so here's the relative time. Here's the idea of the 6 principles. Relative time is going to just put things in order, oldest to youngest. And it uses 6 principles. There are 3 that you should be familiar with. The first one is the idea that sediment layers are laid down flat, original horizontality. And the idea of the law of superposition, that the younger layers will be laid on top of the older layers. The law of superposition, and of course, faunal succession. And that, of course, is the idea that we know things evolved, and so we can date the layers of rock based on the fossils they contain, faunal succession. All right. But absolute time, its name is a little bit misleading. Why? Because it's often based on some of those same principles. More and more based on faunal succession and correlation, less and less on actual radiometric dating. Okay, so geologic time, relative and absolute. Both of them are based on an evolutionary paradigm, or at least the uniformitarian ideas. Okay, absolute dating. Correlation dates the rock layers by the fossils they contain. And what fossils do they use? The index fossils. What is an index fossil? As a review, here it is. Index fossils are distinct fossils. They're particular fossils that have been recognized and cataloged, that are widely distributed, lived a relatively short time, and had a common extinction. Index fossils. Remember, we talked about this previously. If I were to take a fossil into a geologist and ask him about how old he thinks the rock is, what would they do? Chip off a sample of the rock that it was encased in and actually radiometrically date it? Well, it would depend on the rock. If it's in sedimentary rock, they can't date it. But if it's got some surrounding or nearby igneous rock, it could be radiometrically dated. Is that what would happen? No. We'd look up in our compendium and see what index fossil it's associated with, and then we would date it at such and such million years. It's still considered absolute date, because the difference between relative dating and absolute dating is relative just assigns order, absolute assigns a what? A number, an actual date or age. So correlation is still the top dating method. Correlation is not relative, it is so-called absolute, because we will assign an age or a date to the event or to the fossil or to the rock layer. Radioactive dating, here is where we need to get concentrate for today's lecture, is on radiometric dating. What is radiometric dating? How does it work? What can we date with it? Can we trust the dates that we get with radiometric dating? Those are the questions for today. Can we trust that 4.6 billion years that we've dated meteorites? Can we trust radiometric dating? What is radiometric dating? It's going to measure a ratio of radioisotopes remaining in a sample to the amount of radiogenic isotopes. It's going to be a comparison, and we're going to plot a decay curve from it and extrapolate an approximation of when that rock formed by taking the rock sample, a piece of the rock sample, and seeing, okay, how much radioactive or radioisotope, the so-called parent isotope, is left, and how much of the radiogenic or daughter isotope is there, and we'll make a ratio and compare it to the half-life. Okay, there's probably around 40 different radiometric dating techniques using different isotopes and different isolation protocols and so forth. But they all are basically that, a comparison between how much parent isotope is still there compared to the daughter isotope present. Parent isotope is the original radioactive unstable isotope. It's called a radioisotope. The daughter that it decays into is called a radiogenic isotope. It is the stable form. And then we will extrapolate approximately when the decay started, that is when the rock started cooling, by calculating backwards with that particular isotope's half-life. That's radiometric dating in a nutshell. 3 things for you to write down about it and try to summarize what I've just said. The first thing is it's a comparison. We're going to draw a ratio. How much radioisotope, the original unstable, is left compared to how much of the daughter stable radiogenic isotope is there. And we're going to theoretically then, we can extrapolate backwards using that isotope's half-life to a theoretical point in time where the decay began. So it's a comparison, radioisotope versus radiogenic isotope in the sample. It's based on the half-life. And then we will extrapolate backwards to try to calculate when the decay process begins. That's why it's called a radio clock, because theoretically the clock was set at time 0 when the decay began, and then we can stop the clock and figure out how much decay has occurred, calculate it backwards with the half-life. I keep using words like isotope, half-life, and so forth. So let's figure that out and get it down. Isotope. What is an isotope? We have to do a little bit of chemistry here. An isotope. Okay, a lot of different elements. If you're familiar with the periodic table, it has all of the elements. A lot of elements have more than one form. They're called isotopes. Isotopes are atoms of the same element that vary according to their atomic weight, also called atomic mass. And that's due to a different number of neutrons in their nucleus. Okay, if we were to review our chemistry, the capital letter is the element's symbol, chemical symbol. Here we just have an X. If we were talking about carbon, it would be a capital C. Then the mass number up in the corner is the approximate atomic weight, and it's based on what? The number of protons plus neutrons in the nuclei. Then down here we have the atomic number. The atomic number determines which element it is. It determines whether it's nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, argon, helium, hydrogen, whatever element that it is. And that is the number of protons only. So what determines the element is called atomic number, the number of protons in the nucleus. Atomic weight can vary. Atomic weight can vary due to more or less numbers of neutrons in the nucleus of an element. Okay, so here's the very simplest element, hydrogen. And you can see its atomic symbol then is H. This is the most common form of hydrogen. It has only one proton, no neutrons. So in this case, the atomic mass number 1 is equal to the atomic number 1 because there's one proton, no neutrons. There are 2 additional isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. Notice deuterium has an atomic mass number of 2, but it's still hydrogen because it has only 1 proton, and so its nucleus has a neutron. It's still hydrogen, it's just a different isotope. And then this is less common. You can see this has still hydrogen because it has 1 proton, but we have another neutron giving me a mass number of 3. These are 3 different isotopes of hydrogen. Still hydrogen, but this varies according to its atomic weight or mass. Here's one that we'll be dealing with. This is carbon, okay? And normal stable carbon is referred to as carbon-12 because its mass number is 12. 6 protons, 6 neutrons. Protons is the atomic number. It has to stay 6 or it's no longer carbon. Carbon-12, that's an isotope of carbon. It's stable. Carbon-13, another stable form of carbon, just has an extra neutron. So 6 protons make it carbon. 7 neutrons give it atomic weight of 13, so the isotope is referred to as carbon-13. Carbon-14, also called radiocarbon. We'll be getting to radiocarbon, or carbon, so-called carbon-14 dating. This is an unstable isotope of carbon. Still has 6 protons, but it has 8 neutrons, so it has an atomic mass of 14. This is unstable. And it forms the basis of radiocarbon dating, or so-called carbon-14 dating. All right, so when we are dealing with radiometric dating, the first thing we do is we have a ratio. How much radioactive or radioisotope present versus how much radiogenic or daughter isotope present. We set up a ratio, calculate backwards on the half-life, and get to the theoretic time 0 when that rock formed. So, half-life. What is a half-life? It's exactly what it says it is. Okay? Half-life. It's the unit that we use to measure radioactive decay. All right? And it is defined as, you can see it's T. Oh, having a little issue here with this. T1/2, or half-life. It's the time it takes for half of the initial amount of a radioisotope to decay. It's the time it takes for half of the initial amount of the radioisotope to decay to the radiogenic isotope. That's a little messy to understand, so let's explain it. It's exactly what it says it is. Half-life. The time it takes for half of a radioactive sample to decay. So that would mean that at 1 half-life, half of the radioactive radioisotope, the parent, is present, and half is the daughter isotope. Okay, so you can see this is just the basic idea of a half-life. At time 0, it's all parent isotope. And then at time 0, you can see if we had 100,000 grams or whatever number of atoms in this on this scale, if we had 100,000 atoms at time 0, all right, by the first half-life, we are going to be down to how many grams? It's a little hard to read. Let's go to the next slide. Here is carbon-14. Okay, and what happens is at 1 half-life, we're down to half of the sample has decayed, so we're only left of half of the parent. Then by the second half-life, how much of the parent is left? 1/4. Then by another half-life, this is exponential decay. So after 1 half-life, we have 1/2 left. That's 1/2 to the first power. By the second half-life, we have 1/4 left. What is that? Exponential. What's 1/2 squared? What's 1/2 squared? 1/4. What's 1/2 to the third power? 1/8. So by the third half-life, how much of the sample's left? 1/8. It's an exponential decay. So that 1/2, after one half-life, it's 1/2 to the first power. Half the sample's left. Second half-life, it's 1/2 to the second power. 1/4 of the sample is left. By the third half-life, it's exponential decay. So it doesn't decay half, 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 half. It goes half, quarter, eighth. What would be next after 4 half-lives? 1/16 of the sample is left. That's what half-life means. All right, so we have 3 radiometric dating techniques that I want to review and talk about in more detail. The first is uranium to lead. There's a couple of these. So uranium to lead. There are at least 2 unstable uranium isotopes, uranium-235 and uranium-238. This one is uranium-238, and it will go through a complex. It goes through a complex series of subatomic particle emissions to its final radiogenic isotope, which is lead. Remember, lead is Pb. Okay, so we're going to decay from uranium with an atomic mass of 238 through a series of other isotopes until we end up with the final product, the stable radiogenic isotope, which is lead, atomic mass of 206. Okay? So we have the radioisotope is going to decay through a series of, it's complex. It's not just boom, boom. It's a whole series of decays until it ends up at the stable isotope, lead-206. And the half-life is 4.5 billion years. Okay, so this one would have been used to date the meteorites. Then the next, and this one is also very common, is potassium argon. Potassium argon. Potassium argon is potassium, which is K, atomic mass of 40. And this will decay again through a complex series of subatomic particle emissions to its stable radiogenic isotope, argon-40. And again, we're going to have a series of steps involved. It's not a single step. Half-life is 1.3 billion years. And then we have radiocarbon. Radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon is where the radioactive or the radioisotope is that unstable isotope of carbon, carbon-14. It does not decay back to carbon-12, it decays to nitrogen-14. So carbon-14 will decay back to nitrogen-14. All right. So our 2 main radiometric dating techniques are the first 2, uranium-lead and potassium-argon. Those are used to date igneous rocks, and they have very large half-lives. You can see 4.5 for the uranium-lead and 1.3, and those are billion years half-lives for those 2 techniques, probably the 2 most common of the more than 40. Then radiocarbon dating is separate. It's a little bit different than the radiometric dates. Radiocarbon is used to date organic material, once living material. So, of course, if it is igneous rock, it's not going to contain carbon, is it? So we can't date it with radiocarbon. We will date bones, wood, and other organic material with radiocarbon dating. So I'm going to talk about radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating, or so-called carbon-14, it is used to date organic material. If we find, well, even from Mount St. Helens, we might find wood that we want to date and so forth. So it can be used to date bones, teeth, charcoal, fossilized wood, and even seashells, because they will have a carbon component with them. And primarily, we're going to be dating wood, bones, and teeth with carbon-14 dating. We've also found fossil remains that still have part of the bone marrow inside of them that has not completely decayed and disappeared. We would be dating that with carbon-14. So this is based on the decay of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14. It does not go back to stable carbon. It actually changes to a different element altogether. Carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14. We use this primarily on bones, teeth, wood, charcoal. Has to have been organic. Half-life, 5,730 years. Big difference between the radiometric dating half-lives and the radiocarbon. So it has a much smaller half-life. So this can be used on once living material. So can we date the sedimentary rocks themselves? No. Igneous rocks can be dated with radiometric dating. Fossilized once living organic remains can be dated with carbon-14, but sedimentary rock itself cannot be dated. So what we'll do if we want to date sedimentary rock layer, we're going to look at the fossils it contains, and we might look at nearby igneous rock. Sedimentary rock cannot be dated. So radiocarbon dating. All right, let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. Where do we get the carbon-14 and why is it involved with living organisms? Carbon-14 is formed in the upper atmosphere when nitrogen, okay, think about the atmosphere. The atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen gas, right? Remember your junior high science? It's about 78% nitrogen gas. Most of the remaining 20-some% is oxygen, probably around 19 or so. Then there's trace gases like argon and so forth. But most of the atmosphere, around 78% of it, is nitrogen gas. So when the atmosphere is bombarded by cosmic radiation from outer space, it will produce radiocarbon from the normally stable nitrogen atoms. All right, so then in the atmosphere, not only do we have nitrogen and oxygen, we also have a lot of carbon dioxide. You've heard of carbon footprints and the fact we've got to stop the carbon dioxide emissions because we're going to have global warming and on and on and on. That goes. But we do have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and some of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is made with carbon-14 instead of carbon-12. So this radioactive, that sounds bad, but it's really not going to be enough radioactivity to do anything. A lot of this radioactive carbon will be incorporated into carbon dioxide. So if we have carbon-14 atoms and some of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, what happens to that carbon-14? When plants do photosynthesis, what do they take in? Carbon dioxide, and they make glucose out of it. So then what happens is we have radioactive carbon dioxide that has carbon-14 atoms instead of carbon-12 atoms. Plants do photosynthesis, and some of the radioactive carbon-14 is incorporated into plants. And then animals eat plants and so forth. So living organisms some of their carbon atoms are actually carbon-14 that they got from, if they're a plant, they would have gotten it directly from the atmosphere. An animal would have eaten plants that have carbon-14 in them, and so forth. So this is a way that radioactive isotopes are incorporated into living things. So then theoretically, when the living thing dies, the carbon-14 incorporation stops. And we could call that time 0 on our radio clock, right? And that's what they do. So carbon-14 is produced from nitrogen in the atmosphere. Plants are going to pick it up in the form of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Animals are going to eat plants, so there will be radioactive carbon-14 incorporated into living tissues, whether they're plants or animals. And that ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to carbon-12 is theoretically stable while the animal is living. But when the animal dies, guess what? No more new carbon-14 is incorporated, so we have time 0, and we can extrapolate backwards when that organism died. That's radiocarbon dating. There's some big leaps of faith in there, isn't there? So do you understand how carbon-14 works? First of all, it's in living material, once living material only. Secondly, it comes from the atmosphere, because nitrogen in the atmosphere will become radiocarbon, carbon-14, when it is struck by cosmic rays from outer space. Plants will incorporate some of that radioactive carbon in carbon dioxide, and then animals will also incorporate it when they eat plants. So there is radioactive carbon-14 in living tissue right now, all the time. And then theoretically, that ratio stays constant throughout the life of the organism. Then when the organism dies, no more new carbon-14 will be incorporated, so we can time how long it's taking the existing carbon-14 to decay back to nitrogen. So the carbon-14 will decay back to nitrogen-14. So what do? Theoretically, time 0 is when the organism dies, no more new carbon-14, so we can extrapolate backwards and figure out approximately when the organism died. Okay, because theoretically, carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 stays constant in the atmosphere, and so we can just go with a straight extrapolation back. Okay, so what we're going to do then is we're going to base it on the decay of radioactive carbon. Theoretically, time 0 is when the organism dies. So we've got carbon-14 produced from nitrogen in the upper atmosphere. This carbon-14 spontaneous decays back to that nitrogen, and that ratio remains relatively constant both in the atmosphere and in the living things. So living things are continually exchanging that carbon dioxide. That's how we get carbon-14 in living organisms. At death, the exchange stops. So theoretically, that's going to be our time 0. Then we can compare. Notice the comparison. The comparison is between radiocarbon, some of the radiocarbon containing carbon dioxide that we picked up, and the regular carbon. So time 0, we start calculating back when the organism dies based on how much of the carbon-14 is still there. We're not going to measure the nitrogen. Problems with radiocarbon dating and problems with radiometric dating. 4 problems. There they are. We'll discuss them. The first and most important one we're going to take more time on, but we'll go ahead and list it first. It's based on too many assumptions. You heard about a little bit of detail of radiocarbon dating. That's going to assume that the ratios of carbon-14 to nitrogen-14 stay constant, and the exchange rate with the atmosphere remains constant. That is an example of an assumption. Then we have some difficult and complex procedures. We also have known erroneous results. Who can think of a known erroneous result already mentioned? What is it? They dated the lava way off at Mount St. Helens when they knew that it erupted on May 18th, 1980. Less than 35 years ago. All right, so based on too many assumptions, can we even know if those assumptions are valid? Can we know that those rates remain constant, even 5,000 years ago, as the case of carbon? Or can we even know that the decay rate remained constant for uranium? Can we know that over millions and even billions of years? Many of the assumptions, we cannot know them. We can't know for sure if they're true. Where did those assumptions come from? Who can tell me? Ultimately, where did those assumptions come from? Yes?
The evolutionary paradigm.
The evolutionary paradigm. The scientists' worldview, their view that it is that old, is where the assumptions ultimately come from. And here's a very important point to keep in mind. The more assumptions you have to make, the weaker your argument, or the weaker your scientific technique. If we have to base it on a lot of assumptions, it's very scientifically weak. Okay? We want to have as few assumptions as possible. Now, ultimately, everyone's going to make assumptions, and all science revolves on a few basic assumptions. But the more assumptions you have to make the technique work, the more often we have to use the little adverb theoretically. I guess that's a big adverb. The more we have to use that adverb, the more assumptions we have to make, the weaker our resulting science becomes. Difficult and complex procedures. Contamination. Always a problem in lab work. Trace amounts of the radiogenic isotope, in particular the carbon-14. We're dealing with very small amounts of carbon-14. Known erroneous results. Mount St. Helens, remember? Potassium argon dated the known lava dome from 1980 at, 350,000 years old when it was less than 35. That's a big factor. We also have the Rangitoto Island off of New Zealand. This was dated from more lava dating, from eruptions known to have been less than 1,000 years old, dated them anywhere from 145,000 to 465,000. And of course we have living organisms have been carbon dated. And guess what? We've got snails. We've got snails that are 2,000 plus years old, living snails. We also have dated living trees by radiocarbon and gotten 10,000 years old. So we have known erroneous results. All in all, radiocarbon dating is unreliable at best. So it comes down to, who are you going to trust? Let's talk about those assumptions. What assumptions are made in particular with radiometric dating? There are three assumptions made. There are several assumptions made, but here's the three most obvious assumptions made with radiometric dating. First of all, we assume that there's no contamination in the sample of either isotope throughout the time frame involved. That's a big assumption when we're talking millions of years. No contamination, meaning we don't have any loss of parent isotope throughout that time. We don't have any influx of extra daughter isotope. We do not have contamination in the sample of either isotope. That throws the ratio off. Next assumption. is that time zero, so theoretical time zero, it was all parent isotope. So there was no original radiogenic isotope present at so-called time zero. So there's 3 assumptions made. We don't gain or lose either isotope throughout that millions of years. Don't gain either. And then it started at 0 daughter. Next assumption is that the decay has been constant. The rate of decay. Now it's a exponential curve. Has that exponential curve that makes the half-life up, has it remained constant over millions and even a couple billions of years? 3 assumptions of radiometric dating. First is that we don't have any contamination, no extra parent or extra daughter isotope that is not involved in the decay process. Is that possible? Well, sure it is. Okay, that is the assumption of closed system. That's the formal name for this assumption. Closed system. That means we don't have any influx of either radioisotope or radiogenic isotope throughout the sample's history. Then, here's the second assumption. This is called initial conditions. So, can we know the initial conditions of our sample? The answer is, of course not. This is an assumption, and it makes the technique weak. Then, constant rate of decay. There's a few things that can affect the rate of decay. Does anybody know just one of them? One of them is the magnetic field of the Earth. Okay, and then there's all these theories about how the magnetic field of the Earth is, of course it's decaying, we know that, but we have all these theories about reversals of the Earth magnetic field. All kinds of science we're trying to extrapolate from the past. So magnetic fields, changes in the Earth's magnetic fields can affect decay rates. Physical and chemical contamination can affect decay rates. So here's another assumption that's a big step. It's a big leap. High pressure can affect decay rates. Nearby radioactive material of another sample can affect decay rates. So can we make these 3 assumptions? The answer is, well, yes, we do, and we get inflated dates and erroneous results. Okay, I want you to read that quote. Is the print big enough? Can you read it? And I want you to think about it. That's made by Roger C. Wiens. He does have a PhD in physics with a minor in geology. Look at his statement. It has become increasingly clear. Notice the wording and the dogmatic wording. It's become increasingly clear that these radiometric dating techniques agree with each other and as a whole present a coherent picture in which the Earth was created a very long time ago. Further evidence comes from the complete agreement between radiometric dates and other dating methods such as counting tree rings or glacier ice cores. That man is an old Earth creationist, which to me makes no sense. So if we were created a long, long time ago, where's all the history from it? And so on. There's all kinds of problems with old Earth creationism. It's a compromise. That quote is almost exactly opposite of some of the things that I just said, isn't it? So who are you going to trust? You can find information for both sides, can't you? You can. So then you have to examine things for yourself and decide, who am I going to trust? This man says dogmatically the opposite of many of the things we've talked about, doesn't he? Okay, he is an old Earth creationist. But all dating techniques make those same 3 basic assumptions that we went through quickly with radiometric dating, including the ice core samples and so forth. Constancy of rates, that is a major assumption. Do radioactive decay rates change? Yes. Do other rates change, like the recession of the moon? Have you heard that argument for a young Earth? Sedimentation on the moon, or sedimentation in the ocean, salt levels of the ocean, dust on the moon, all of those are still the same, and they still make the same three assumptions. Have I used those arguments? Why not? Because I don't think they're very scientifically strong, because those, even our creationist young Earth arguments, you know some of them, don't you? Salt in the ocean, dust on the moon receding from the Earth, they all make these same three assumptions, so I'm not using them. You know why? I don't need them. Because my paradigm is not really based in science. What is my paradigm based on? The Bible. So who are you going to trust? The radiometric dating techniques that tell us that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old? Or are you going to trust the Bible? And besides, the science is actually much weaker than they're going to let you onto. Do you understand that? So all of those dating techniques, whether it's me as a creationist saying there's not enough dust on the moon, or me as a creationist saying there's not enough salt in the oceans, they're all based on assumptions. Don't forget, best kept secret of evolutionary biology. What is it? Fossil record doesn't fit and isn't used. Best kept secret of geology now. What is it? The radiometric dating is hardly even used. What's used? Correlation, faunal succession, index fossils. There's the geologic column. Some of you did not get these. That's on the test. Do you have them? Okay, you're dismissed.